And now I'm going to talk about who the real villains of the Pickwick Papers are. And it's a pair of lawyers called Dodson and Fogg. So let me give you enough detail about who they are, what they did. One of the structured plot elements, one of the only structured plot elements in the book, has to do, it starts out with a comedic situation, very sitcom-y, where Mrs. Bardell, who is a widow and the landlady for Mr. Pickwick, is talking with Pickwick. Pickwick is contemplating, well, he's hiring Sam Weller, and I'll talk about Sam Weller another time. And rather than just coming out and asking Mrs. Bardell if it's okay for him to keep a manservant, he keeps going on and on that she's interpreting what he's saying as a proposal of marriage. Okay, so that's that. And the next thing we hear, she faints into his arms and yada yada, and his friends see it. So next thing we hear, Pickwick's getting a letter from Dodson and Fogg, a pair of lawyers, saying that Mrs. Bardell is suing him for breach of promise, saying that he had promised to marry her and he's not doing it, therefore I'm going to sue you. So this is not something that comes up in modern usage anymore, but it shows up a couple of times in Dickens novels, though most of the time not as a plot element, just something in the past. So that's breach of promise. Anyway, it is very ridiculous. It goes to trial, and Pickwick loses, partly because all of his friends are just total idiots. Sam Weller is the only one who performs well in the witness box. Pickwick loses, so he owes, I'm trying to remember what the damages that were declared, if it was like £1,500 or something like that. I want you to keep in mind, Mr. Pickwick can easily afford that amount of money, and that was a lot of money. He is a wealthy man. He's a single wealthy man. And then he refuses to pay. He goes to the Fleet prison, which was a debtor's prison. And what ultimately happens, though, because he's refusing to pay, and Dodson and Fogg did this case on speculation, so this is how, we often have with tort lawyers now, in that you don't pay the lawyer anything, they get a certain percentage of the cut. My own family did this once. We had a medical malpractice lawsuit. Anyway, and this is how the lawyers get paid. So evidently, though, because Mr. Pickwick is not paying the award and costs and all of that, he refuses to pay a thing. What happens is Dodson and Fogg take Mrs. Bardell. She can't afford to pay them at all, their costs. So they throw her into the Fleet prison. And this is part of what convinces Pickwick, it's not the only thing, to finally pay. He doesn't pay the full amount. He just pays the cost to the lawyers. Mrs. Bardell gets nothing, but she does get out of the debtor's prison. But the whole point of Dodson and Fogg, and this is not the first time we're going to see the evil of a system. It's a very banal kind of evil. The lawyers don't get a comeuppance at all. Mr. Pickwick does chew them out. They do not look good. And he has several other lawyers of a similar bent in later novels. And again, actually, I'm just sitting here thinking, before I did this, none of the lawyers ever get punished for any of this. And there is a reason lawyers get a certain kind of reputation. Okay, I'm not saying lawyers now do this, but there's all sorts of what they call sharp practice that looks really bad. And the main reason they're villains, okay? Now, Mr. Perker, who is Mr. Pickwick's lawyer, I can't say he admires them per se, but he says, this is actually professional. You couldn't make a bar complaint against these guys, for example. And the issue is, and Sam Weller is the one who really points it out, that if it weren't for these lawyers, that she wouldn't have thought of bringing a breach of promise suit. They are a way of introducing dissension in terms of alienating neighbor from neighbor, literally. That it wouldn't have been very complimentary to Mrs. Bardell for her to realize there was no way in hell that Pickwick was going to marry her. He was a longtime bachelor. She was middle-aged. She has a young son herself. She's not that attractive. And, you know, she was lucky to have a good tenant like him. Well, she ruined it. The lawyers basically encourage people to do lawsuits. This is not new to Dickens. This is not new in history. You can see it going back to the ancient Greeks, where they're complaining about the propensity of people to sue each other. And if you have successful, like, tort lawyers and this, that, and the other, you know, it's a necessary evil to a certain extent, but we will see even worse lawyer behavior in later novels where it drives destruction. Bleak House is the one I have in mind in particular. So we will be seeing that in months to come. So, later.